Welcome everyone to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I'm Andrew Weiss. I'm the Vice President for Studies here. It is great to see a lot of old friends and a crowded room here for this really important session with Yaroslav Trofimov, the Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent of the Wall Street Journal, talking about his wonderful new book, Our Enemies Will Vanish, and he'll be talking with Susan Glasser, a longtime friend of the Carnegie Endowment, who's a staff writer at The New Yorker. One small point of order before we get started: I'd really appreciate if people could silence their cell phones, and I really look forward to today's event. Welcome.
Oh my gosh, Andrew, that was so brief. All right. No, seriously, thank you so much, Andrew, and to Carnegie. I love Carnegie, and it was many, many years ago that my husband and I launched our book about a very different Russia, but the very same, I'm afraid, leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin. This book by Yaroslav is a fantastic read, and I can do the publicizing for him so that he doesn't have to do the shameless publicity. But seriously, do yourself a favor. At a moment when Washington is about to be and already is consumed by our own inward-looking troubles, and the fate of our assistance to Ukraine itself is uncertain. I'm sure we'll talk about that. It's really an important, I think, sort of level setting to go back to read this book, which largely covers the unbelievably dramatic and really horrific events, in particular of the first year of the war. And this is a personal story for Yaroslav, too, and we'll talk about that as well. He's not just the senior foreign affairs correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, but he grew up in Kyiv, and he talks about that. And he talks about what it means when war comes to your homeland in a way that is really profound. But for me, it's also just a delightful chance to reconnect with an old friend. Yaroslav and I actually met in 2003 in Kuwait in the run-up to the Iraq War. I was what you might call a tourist in the business of war correspondence. We actually drove into Iraq together one morning. Let's just say he was our fearless leader as we pretended to be other government agencies cruising across the border with Iraq. But I left that business, and Yaroslav has stuck with it and become really one of the premier foreign correspondents and war correspondents of our generation. So we're really lucky, I think, to have someone with such experience and grounding, and also this personal connection to be telling us the story of the war. So congratulations, Yaroslav, and thank you for doing this very dangerous business of bearing witness to what's happening in Ukraine.
Thank you so much for all this generous praise, Susan. And so when we were driving into Iraq and many other wars that I have covered in my career, they were difficult, there were lots of emotions, but these were wars in other people's countries. And obviously it's fundamentally different when the city where you grew up, when the landmarks that you have all these childhood memories about are assaulted by a very unprovoked, very violent invasion. And obviously in those first days in Kyiv, after the invasion, nobody in this town and few people around the world really believe that Ukraine will hold out and that Kyiv will not fall within 3 days or maybe 3 weeks. And the very fact that now 2 years almost since the invasion, we are here talking about Ukrainian resistance, talking about Ukrainian counteroffensives, is a testament to this miracle. The fact that the entire NATO alliance was created to try to hold back, the Russian armies from overrunning, the plains of Germany and conquering Europe. And so Ukraine by itself, initially without very little Western assistance, and certainly without having to spill the blood of foreign soldiers, has been able to hold back the Russians, to repel them, and to to liberate more than half of the land that Russia had conquered, which, if you sort of zoom out from the current debates about the tactical setbacks and the failures of the counteroffensive at the end of 2023, is really nothing short of miraculous. And the book itself, the main chronology starts a day before the Russian invasion. It starts with me going to see President Poroshenko, the former president of Ukraine, who had scheduled an interview with me and then called me and said, come right now. And so I came to see him, and we spoke about various things. It wasn't very interesting, but then at the end he leaned towards me and said, tomorrow after 4 a.m. there'll be invasion, so it's your chance to hop on a plane and get out of here. And a lot of people did. Obviously, I had come to Ukraine to witness what seemed an increasingly likely invasion. And in those first hours and days of the war, nobody really knew how it's going to pan out. People say that human character opens up its war like a tin can. You never know what's inside, because it's not just the outsiders that know what's inside you, but also people themselves, until they are in this stressful...
They themselves did not know what was going to happen.
Right, and also people themselves, until they are in the stressful circumstances, they know how they will react.
Now, you have this very interesting conversation in the book. I think you interviewed Boris Johnson, the then British Prime Minister, now former British Prime Minister, and he recounted firsthand what, we've all seen the reports, but it must have been something to talk with Boris Johnson as he's remembering this phone call with Zelensky in the very first hours of the war, and people were really, he was offering to set up basically a government in exile, just as the Polish government in exile had set up in London back in World War II. What was that like?
Yeah, exactly. And I think Boris Johnson's call was one of many that Zelensky was receiving in those days. Boris Johnson, like everyone else, had been briefed by intelligence, American intelligence, British intelligence, NATO intelligence, that Ukraine really didn't have a chance. And that is the intelligence that also explains why Ukraine didn't really receive much military assistance before the war. There was all this, publicity of American planes flying crates of weapons, but in fact, what the Ukrainian National Security Advisor told me, Ukraine received only 90 Javelins, anti-tank missiles before the war, which is a little more than a symbolic amount. And the reasons for this are manifold. One of them is obviously what happened in Afghanistan just a few months earlier, when President Ashraf Ghani, just hours after pledging to defend the city, got into a helicopter and flew out and ended up in Abu Dhabi. And then all this American military gear ended up in the hands of the Taliban, who started driving Humvees and even flew a Black Hawk.
Now, one thing I wanted to ask you about actually is, I know, the book is not really, it's really an account of the war and not about the politics, but I think for a Washington audience, this question about Vladimir Zelensky was so unpopular before the war, right? The polls had him absolutely down in the dumps, I think something around 30% or so. Then, of course, he rallies the country, rallies the world, becomes super popular. What was the nature of his leadership at that moment in time? When you're meeting with Poroshenko, he was openly, going after Zelensky. There was a sense that Zelensky was outmatched to the challenge. What was your personal sense of the politics then, and is any of that relevant to what might happen in the future?
Well, I think Zelensky might have been unpopular in the way he was running the country before the war, but the war was not about Zelensky. The war was not about politics. The war was about the survival of Ukraine as not just a state, but as a people and as a culture, because we clearly see now that Russia, in the Russian government circles, what Medvedev is putting on Telegram, they don't just want to abolish Ukraine as a separate state, but wipe out the language, the culture, basically turn it to Russia by re-educating generations of Ukrainian children. And so Zelensky, first of all, by the fact that he stayed, that he rejected all this advice from Boris Johnson and from others, and insisted on staying in his office and running the country from Kyiv, even as Russian troops were, a few miles away and were, on the verge of encircling Kyiv. That by itself, especially after what happened in Kabul a month earlier, I think was a very important psychological marker, and that made other people stay in their jobs. They made other, military commanders, mayors, governors also resist. And what we've seen at the very beginning is that the Russians didn't really expect resistance. And I think President Putin really believed his own Kool-Aid, that the Russians and the Ukrainians are one people, and that the Ukrainians will switch sides and sweep away this little, clique of CIA-funded neo-Nazis, as he put it. And on the local level, wherever a mayor would put up, a couple of bulldozers or dump trucks on the road, the Russians would just stop there and try to go somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And so the spontaneous resistance by local officials, even before the armed forces had a chance to come.
Well, that's right. You expand, and I'm glad you did, because I've always thought this is one of the key moments. You recount this all-important battle for the airport in Hostomel, which is right on the outskirts of Kyiv. And, many people, I think, correctly believe this is actually the moment when the fate of Kyiv hung in the balance. And it was heroic resistance, but also luck in many ways that enabled very untrained Ukrainian defenders to, they didn't succeed entirely, but they held off the Russians for a long enough time. What was that like?
Well, it wasn't entirely luck, because the Ukrainians knew about plans for the Russians to land the airborne force in Hostomel. So there was a force there, but there were also many other bits of intelligence. So the force was not very big. It was a National Guard force, but they had dispersed before the first Russian missile strikes, and they had taken positions. And they, even though there was always announcement about Stringers being supplied before the war, there was only a handful of them. They didn't have any, but they had the sort of the Soviet vintage anti-aircraft missiles, and they did shoot down several of the initial helicopters that were carrying elite Russian forces.
Right, these were the people who were meant to take over Kyiv.
Right, so the Russian plan in the first morning of the war was to fly, several dozen helicopters with elite airborne forces who would secure the perimeter of the airfield in Hostomel, which has, I think, the largest runway in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. It's the airfield that is used by the Antonov aircraft manufacturing plant. And then bring in, 1, 2, 3 brigades of the Russian VDV airborne forces with all their heavy equipment. And so they succeeded in eventually taking over the airfield, but by that time, other reinforcements arrived. Ukrainian artillery shelled the runway, and none of these fixed-wing planes at the end of the day managed to land there, which saved Kyiv, because if the Russians had 10,000 troops in Hostomel by the end of the first day of the war, they would have probably taken Kyiv. There was one brigade of the Ukrainian military on the entire Kyiv front at the time.
Mm-hmm. Now, another, what you identify, and of course, many others as well, as a pivotal moment was a little bit later when the atrocities started to become clear in how Russia was fighting. And that ultimately is this horrific moment when the world sees what happened in Bucha. But it actually was leading up to that. There were already examples, and you were driving around the country, basically, seeing for yourself the kind of atrocities, that this was not a sort of Potemkin-type operation, but in fact, absolutely like a war on the people and the earth itself of Ukraine. In some way that seemed to change the nature of what was politically possible. You talk about the negotiations that were occurring between the Ukrainians and the Russians, first in Belarus next door, and then later in Turkey, and that they were essentially derailed by what Zelensky and others saw as the unforgivable, brutal nature of the war on the Ukrainian population.
Yeah, so Bucha was really the first time when the Russian occupation receded and people saw what happened when the Russians were in charge. Because when the Russians were in Bucha, they cut off communications, they jammed the phone signals, so people didn't really have a way of knowing what was happening there. But in the very first weeks of the war, we went to Kharkiv, which is the second largest city of Ukraine. And while Kyiv was relatively spared by the Russians in those days because they were hoping to take it over and install a puppet regime, they did manage to enter Kharkiv. They got repelled. There was, again, because they didn't expect resistance, they sent a relatively small force of special forces who got ambushed and killed or captured. This is what the Russian commentators called Black Hawk Down without Black Hawks, really. Right. Because the Russians could not fly helicopters because of Ukrainian air defenses. And then the Russians just started obliterating Kharkiv. The entire central area of Kharkiv was hit by missiles, and When we drove in there, the only place to stay in Kharkiv was in the underground. So sort of we slept in the subway. So we saw this war on civilians already early on, but obviously in Bucha, which was retaken by the Ukrainians a day after these talks in Istanbul, everybody saw the sheer horror of the torture, the summary executions, just Russian troops killing people in the streets. And that changed minds across Ukraine because this was just one tip of the iceberg. There were other things happening in places like Mariupol. We don't know until now what happened in Mariupol because the Russians just bulldozed
the evidence.
all these areas, and we don't know, tens of thousands of people died there. And that made it much harder to accept Russian rule of any part of Ukraine or any area that still has Ukrainians.
So it changed the politics. Did it change your mind? I mean, was there anything fundamentally, shocking to you? You have seen wars all over the place, not just that conflict in Iraq. This has, in some ways, been the Russian template of war when you look at the attacks inside Chechnya, inside the borders of Russia itself, when you look at, say, the destruction of Aleppo in Syria. You see a playbook that already existed. Why do you think this had such particular resonance?
So I had actually a WhatsApp conversation with someone I know in Russia the night before the invasion, and we're sort of talking about what might happen. And it was really, I was telling him that it's really hard for me to understand that after all this rhetoric about Russia's Ukrainians being one people, and all this multitude of family and social links between Russians and Ukrainians, especially in places like Kharkiv, especially Donbass, for Russia to go full Aleppo on Ukraine.
Yeah.
Because, it was much easier to other...
And this is the day before the invasion.
It was much easier to other the Chechens, to other, the Syrians, and yet Russia succeeded in that. And if you look at the discourse in Russia now, it's just as dehumanizing.
So what did your friend say in Russia?
He told me that they might succeed. And in fact, they have.
Yeah.
Succeeded in dehumanizing Ukrainians to a level.
So they've changed Russians in a way, as much
absolutely.
as they've changed Ukrainians. And so this is a Washington audience, and I know when we get questions from the audience, and by the way, you're encouraged to submit questions. There are these forms. You just do a QR code. I think it's actually very easy. So please do fire away at us. But I know it's a Washington audience, so I'll preempt some of those questions because they want to know, what your sort of ground truth means, for our very removed from the ground truth political debates. You have a piece in the Washington Post today, that makes the argument that, really the key moment that was missed to a certain extent for Washington and other Western capitals to supply Ukraine was in that first year of the war, especially in the fall of that first year when there were successes at pushing Russia back. What do you base that conclusion on? And, is there anything in your view that can change that dynamic now?
Well, I mean, obviously, there is no guarantee that it would have been successful then either, but clearly there was a much better chance for Ukraine to break through at the time where Putin refused to mobilize reservists because of political considerations at home, because it would have meant that the special military operation, quote unquote, had not gone to plan. And at the time, there were only about 100,000 Russian combat troops in Ukraine, and all these fortifications and minefields that were built during the winter of 2020-2023 hadn't been constructed yet.
Right, the sort of World War I lesson, don't let your foes dig in.
Exactly. And so the Ukrainians were asking for everything that they received in 2023, the tanks, the Patriots, the fighting vehicles, since the beginning of the war. And, if looking back, if it didn't cause an escalation, if it didn't cause a nuclear war in 2023, there is no reason to think it would have caused a nuclear war in 2022.
What did you think back in that moment in time? I know it's hard to reconstruct it. When you first started hearing this nuclear saber rattling from Putin and those around him, the former leader, Dmitry Medvedev, has become one of the most hysterical voices, on this front. A lot of people discounted it, but here in Washington, it was always taken seriously on the theory that okay, well, maybe it's nothing, it's probably nothing, but, we can't afford to be wrong.
Well, I think the Ukrainians were always very skeptical about that. And very few people in the government in Ukraine, when I ask them about that, believe that's a credible threat. But also, if you start taking nuclear blackmail seriously, how do you stop? Like, if Putin was allowed to say, I'm going to use nukes, so give me Ukraine, well, what's going to happen if he says, I'm going to use nukes unless you let me take Estonia or Poland? Once you establish the principle that you can invade another country and then use your nuclear power as a deterrent against any action to reverse that invasion, then it just encourages at the end of the day. It makes it much more dangerous at the end of the day.
Well, both you and I have observed for a long time, the persistent belief among many people in Washington and many previous crises with Vladimir Putin, that there's always perennially some idea of some mythic exit ramp that he's going to take from the various escalations that he's taken over the course of the last 20 years. I'm wondering, what about the Ukrainian officials, both political and also military leaders that you've spoken with? Have they had the same kind of narrative, or does it look very different there? For them, was this a question of missed off-ramps, or that it was about us fundamentally and our dealings with Russia? Or, did they always see this as part of a long-term plan by Vladimir Putin?
I think the belief in Ukraine, almost universally, not just in the political and military class, is that the very existence of a sovereign Ukrainian state is unacceptable to Putin and to much of the Russian political class. And so that means that any off-ramp will just be an off-ramp to the next round. And as it was after 2014. And especially now, after Putin had staked so much on this war, after so many Russian casualties, to him it's politically more advantageous to continue this conflict as opposed to seek an off-ramp that could not be portrayed as a victory. And certainly nothing at the current front lines could be portrayed as a victory, because all the fighting now is, technically speaking, according to Russian law, being carried out on the territory of the Russian Federation, because Putin had annexed these 4 Ukrainian regions.
So currently about 18% of Ukraine remains under the control of Russia. And there is certainly a view that is quite widespread here in Washington, not only at the Pentagon, but among the political class, that it's essentially an unwinnable war for Ukraine if you define that as kicking Russia off of that remaining 18% of the territory. I'm curious what your assessment of that is.
Well, certainly the Ukrainian offensive of last year showed that it's difficult. And I think at the end of the day, the situation now is a dynamic stalemate where the Russians tried to advance earlier in 2023, and they did have a lot of successes. They took Bakhmut at the cost of tens of thousands of lives, but that's about it. It's still a pretty small town. And then they've been trying to advance again last 3 months. And looking forward, probably the most likely scenario is that the war will be won by the society that proves to be more resilient, doesn't crack from within. And so it's either a change inside Russia or a change inside Ukraine. And Ukraine's resilience, to a large extent, depends on the levels of Western support, not just military, but also economic.
So we'll get to the questions and keep them coming. I really only have a few here. But I do want to take it back to the level of personal experience, because it is such an extraordinary thing for you to have driven around this. And I do think we tend to get lost in the policy debates. Was there anything, what surprised you the most? Is the city that you grew up in, if you think back to Soviet times, did you understand it to be a very different place than the Moscow of the same era when you grew up in the 1980s?
Yeah, I think Kyiv was always different. I mean, Kyiv was a much more Russian-speaking city when I was growing up there, but it was always looking west in terms of culture. And I think the Russian-speaking elites in Kyiv adopted this Ukrainian identity when the communism started to collapse, because that was the way of getting closer to the West, culturally and economically. And the Ukrainian identity now is a very complex one, because there used to be a very ethnic-based, quite far-right Ukrainian ethno-nationalism in the darkest hours of World War II, especially, and there was a lot of rethinking of what it means to be Ukrainian in the following decades. And I think when Ukraine became independent, this the wisest choice that was made was to say that everyone here is a Ukrainian. Mm-hmm. Being a Ukrainian means you live here, you like this country. That's all it's, So there was, and I think that's what allowed Ukraine to survive this war, because, look at Ukraine now. It has a president who happens to be Jewish. It has a defense minister who happens to be Muslim. It had the head of land forces, happens to be originally from Russia. So it doesn't matter. And I think this new Ukrainian identity that developed in the last 30 years is something that wasn't understood in the West and in Moscow. And so when people started speaking about Russian speakers, Ukrainian speakers, people may speak whatever they want, but that didn't change.
Right. They had a map in mind of the country, and the map was, the color, the side that you were on was dictated essentially by what language you spoke. Right. But when you drove around the country during the war, you found that to be really not the case.
But I think it stopped being the case long before that. Because when these maps were drawn, it was before the war of 2014. Mm-hmm. And, there were legitimate debates before that, where is Ukraine's economic future, what's better, and lots of people had family and economic ties with Russia. But after the Russian invasion and annexation, and during that sort of so-called Russian spring that Putin had organized, Russia, in many minds, was still, especially among the older generation, was synonymous with higher wages, prosperity. But then they saw what happened in the areas under Russian rule. And if you look at Donetsk and Lugansk...
Right, so Russia was its own worst advertisement for itself.
Yeah, because there was actual practical experiment. Okay, right. You have this...
It would have been better for them to launch a bigger invasion in 2014, in some ways.
Oh, they probably would have won in 2014.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because obviously the Ukrainian military was also, much less advanced than it was years later, and it wasn't battle-hardened. But you did find some areas. I was struck as you drove around the country, you did find some places where there were traders. There were people who, there were local officials who went over, who stayed behind when the Russians came in. There were people who were clearly pre-positioned, or some planning that went into it. What distinguished those who went over to the Russians and those who didn't?
I think in some ways there were circumstances, because some areas fell really quickly. They fell really the first, second days of the war, in part because these local officials had been bought by the Russians before the war. I think what is interesting is that the Russians probably had many, many more people on their payroll, because the Russian intelligence agencies, had a very vast network of assets and agents there. But a lot of the people to whom they paid money over the years,
it was a bad investment.
I didn't actually support them when the hour came, because they were.
So you mean there was corruption?
Well,
I'm shocked.
I mean, probably a lot of this money never reached the intended recipients.
Right. Well, that's also possible. Yeah. They had lists, but we don't know, what the lists were.
Yeah, that is actually, I'm talking about it in the book, because that was the source of disagreement between the U.S. and Ukrainian intelligence officials ahead of the war, because there were warnings from here saying that Russia is going to invade and has all this plan to conquer Ukraine, and people in Ukrainian military intelligence were saying, well, what Putin is being told, but we know what's happening in the lower ranks. And we know how hollow the Russian army is and how much corruption there is. And this force that they have is too small to really conquer Ukraine, which turned out to be true at the end.
Right. There's also been a lot of disagreements that have been reported recently, and in particular, not only disagreements inside Ukraine between the presidential administration and the General Zaluzhny, the Ukrainian chief of staff, but of course also between the Pentagon and the Ukrainians over the plan for the counteroffensive and going forward. What light can you shed on that? What is your view about, it's inevitable, especially when this enormous volume of material has been given, because they were slow starting, but now, as you point out, in 2023, there's been a, quote, mountain of steel delivered to Ukraine. How how do you foresee that relationship going? Will they just Ukrainians not listen to the Pentagon and keep taking the stuff, or?
Well, I mean, going back first to Zaluzhny and Zelensky, obviously, they have different jobs and they have different views, and on certain tactical issues. But I think both are mindful of the fact that in the past centuries, and 17th century and 20th century, Ukraine's statehood collapsed because of strife within. Mm-hmm. And so I think there is a lot of effort to find common ground and to work together despite occasional disagreements, which are happen in wars. If you remember Eisenhower, MacArthur. So on the other hand, if we analyze the relative failure of the Ukrainian counteroffensive last year, there's a lot of blaming around going on, and there clearly were mistakes made by Ukrainians. Clearly, there was an issue of training of these new brigades, but there were also mistakes made by partners. And I think both sides are talking to each other about how to move forward from this.
Now, there's a lot of good questions starting to come in, including, let me throw a few at you that are on this, stick on this subject of the military aspect of the conflict. One question is, what are your thoughts on Ukrainian personnel losses so far, and the ability of Ukraine to continue to field adequate numbers of troops in what we have to imagine might be a prolonged conflict?
So obviously, I don't have the number. The numbers are classified. There were extrapolations made. There were a few towns that have made up monuments listing everyone who was killed there. That point to maybe 50, 70,000 killed in action among military personnel, which is a high number, of course. But you compare it to numbers of casualties in other conflicts in history. Ukraine still has a lot of manpower and an ability to keep fighting, especially if the fight is existential. Mm-hmm. I think there are recruitment problems now of the kind that weren't there 2 years ago, because let's face it, a young person in Kyiv is not necessarily interested in dying for Avdiivka, and the front lines are stable.
But he or she would fight for Kyiv.
Yes, and also Ukraine has been trying to spare, part deliberately, in part because of just how things happen, the younger men. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the soldiers on the front lines are in the 40s and the 50s, in part because of the skills. If you want to find somebody who already knows how to drive a tank, it's probably somebody who served in the Soviet Army and drove a tank in 1985. But there's still millions and millions of young men in Ukraine.
So here's another military question, which is a scenario. Is there a concern that you have about the possibility of Ukrainian military collapsing and Russia taking Mykolaiv and Odessa and possibly even Zaporizhia and Kherson?
Well, I mean, everything is possible. As long as Ukraine has the ammunition to fight, it's hard to imagine Odessa falling. Right. And Mykolaiv. Zaporizhia is probably the more vulnerable of them. Russia is also exhausted, and Russia also, is having, humongous casualties in personnel and loss of material. But obviously, now we are in a situation where, in part thanks to North Korean ammunition, Russia has a massive advantage over Ukraine in terms of ammunition, artillery ammunition. And obviously the fact that the U.S. funding has all but ceased because of Congress is making it much harder for the Ukrainians and really resulting in lost lives.
Yeah, talk a little bit more about that based on your discussions and experience in Ukraine as well as your reporting here in Washington. How serious do you assess the threat of U.S. assistance ending to Ukraine, and what would be the implications for the conflict if it did?
I mean, it's really hard to assess how serious is that threat because people keep saying it's going to get done, and it's not getting done. And sort of, everybody's...
So maybe not trust the assessments of the people who said it was going to pass months ago.
Yeah, obviously, the U.S. Well, the U.S. now accounts for only about half of overall assistance to Ukraine. The Europeans pick up the rest of the slack. Obviously, the U.S. has the stockpiles, especially of ammunition, that the Europeans don't have, and the industrial base that the Europeans are very slow in upgrading and developing. So American aid remains critical, especially military aid. I think there is sort of magical thinking among some people who think that, well, if we stop aiding Ukraine, there'll be a ceasefire, we'll force Ukraine to a ceasefire. But that's not the case. I think if aid drops substantially, it will just encourage Russia to keep going forward and return to their original goals.
Yeah, no, I want to ask you about that because there is no more persistent view. I mean, you can pick it up in the U.S. press. You see it in the comments of people. There's almost this idea of that there's some kind of an off switch for the war, that there's going to be some, Paris peace talks and, a negotiated end to this conflict. Can you foresee any scenario in which the Ukrainians would agree to a negotiated end to the conflict with Putin?
I think the question is, do I foresee any scenario in which Russia would agree to it? And, let's go back to the legal reality in Russia. Russia currently is fighting on what is considered Russian territory. Two capitals of Russian regions are under Ukrainian occupation as far as Russian law is concerned. And Putin just 2 weeks ago said that Odessa is a Russian city, and Medvedev said that Kyiv is a Russian city. Accepting the status quo for Russia would mean the strategic defeat.
Yeah. So, in effect, Russia's already been defeated in some ways. This is a thing that you've heard President Biden say, actually, and a number of his advisors. Do you agree with that?
Well, so Russia has been defeated in Ukraine's war of independence, but it has not been defeated in Ukraine's war of restoring territorial integrity.
Right. Well, that's a good distinction. A lot of the questions from the audience are smart questions that take the global context, I would say, or a broader geopolitical context in which the conflict is playing out. Yeah, Yaroslav recently, by the way, had a very interesting, very provocative piece contrasting the conflict in Ukraine with how the debate over the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza is playing out. And I want to ask you about that, first of all. Do you see a direct impact, in a way, between the outbreak of this Israel-Hamas war and what's happening in the war in Ukraine? Do you think that less attention and focus on Ukraine in the West is having an actual consequence in terms of the war itself?
And I think what Ukraine necessarily needs is attention. I don't think, additional visits by Secretary Blinken are going to change the course of the war. What it needs is funding. Mm-hmm. And the reason why funding is tied up in Congress, I think, has little to do with the merits of the war in Ukraine, especially now it's all bundled together with border security. Mm-hmm. I think what the war in Gaza has shown is really highlighted the sort of selective empathy around the world. If you look at the Venn diagram of the people who care deeply for the suffering of Ukrainians and suffering of Palestinians, it's not as large as we could have hoped for, and people are looking at this through the prism of geopolitics, denying agency to ordinary people, and not really looking at it through just sort of human empathy. No,
that's right. In fact, there's a lot of commentary, understandably, on the question of, what is the difference between the critique that Western leaders have made very powerfully at times over Putin's targeting of the civilian population in Ukraine and the civilian deaths that have resulted in Ukraine versus Israel's targeting of what are, of course, going to be enormous civilian casualties when you undertake that kind of bombing in a highly populated area like Gaza. What does your reporting suggest about that? And I'm actually also curious, what do Ukrainians say about that?
Well, I think the opinion in Ukraine has changed somewhat. So initially there was this wave of
support
for Israel, in part because, again, this is geopolitical prism. Most Palestinians, on social media, etc., initially were at least not supportive of Ukraine, if not openly supportive of Russia. both Hamas and President Abbas were very supportive of Russia during the invasion of Ukraine. And a lot of Ukrainians have family and friends in Israel and see the conflict through the prism of these family connections. But again, when they started seeing scenes of this exodus from North Gaza, of people dragging their pets and their children and their possessions, that was very similar to the scenes we have seen, of people in Irpin Bucha escaping from the Russians, just on the visual level.
Yeah.
And in the piece, I'm quoting, the Ukrainian Nobel Prize winner, who runs a sort of a human rights NGO, saying that people are asking me, do you support the Israelis or the Palestinians? And that's the wrong way of looking at it. We support humanity.
Yeah. What do you have any light to shed on China's role in the conflict and how much it really has helped Russia? Of course, hard to forget that it was just literally, days before the war broke out that Putin visited Xi Jinping in China and they talked about their no limits partnership. Has it actually been a no limits partnership?
I mean, from my understanding is that the deputy foreign minister who coined that phrase has since been removed.
Along with many
Yes.
other officials.
But I think he was removed precisely for that phrase. So I think
So she wants limits.
she clearly has imposed
There are
limits.
limits, yeah.
Yes, so there has been no direct Chinese lethal aid to Russia. I think, and I wrote another piece in the journal kind of looking at what lessons the Chinese are taking from Russia's misadventures in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. I think one main lesson was just how incompetent the Russian military is, and suddenly thinking we can do better. But also,
There's, of course, a long-standing view in China of Russian incompetence as an explanation for a lot of phenomena, including the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Exactly. So, but just on the personal level, I sent out an email when the book was launched to many people in my contact book. I got a reply from a pretty senior Chinese think tank person, saying we wish Ukraine independence and victory, which was very surprising.
Interesting. Very interesting. Is that an on-the-record email? Did the person put their name to it?
Oh, yes. Well, I mean,
a number of these questions I think are great, and they take it back to your own experience of having to write about such a fraught subject. One of our commenters says you've done a remarkable job doing highly credible reporting while at the same time not pretending to be totally neutral about the war, as reporters are often expected to do. Do you think that you've covered this war any differently than the other conflicts you've covered because of your personal connections to Ukraine?
I mean, on one level, on many levels, yes. I think, first of all, being from there, understanding, the languages and the culture, while also having spent most of my life outside of Ukraine, so being able to see it also.
Right. How old were you when you left?
So I was not even 20. Actually, I was 20, yeah. Just barely, yeah. I left in 1990, so it was still the Soviet Union. And, but I've been coming back quite often, and so you could sort of have at your fingertips the sense of the culture and what people are thinking, and that you probably don't have. I didn't have, in other wars, I didn't have this bond and intimate connection with the Iraqis because of the barriers of language and culture and history. I think obviously there is a question of bias, and in the modern world of journalism, there are lots of people covering countries where they or their parents are from. But I think compared to every other conflict I've covered, this was the easiest because it was probably morally the most clear war. There are many shades of gray, war within Israel and the Palestinians, and conflicting narratives. But here, it was a clear case of unprovoked invasion to a country that had not threatened Russia, hadn't done anything to Russia.
Now, we've been talking in a pretty high-altitude way about a lot of these issues, but there were actually times in your reporting when, just in a basic sense, being a Ukrainian was a huge advantage, and it stopped you from getting shot at checkpoints and the like, right? Now, did you grow up speaking Ukrainian also at home, or Russian and Ukrainian?
Mostly Russian, but I went to, so I aspired to be an artist and a painter. And so I went to an art school when I was a teenager in Kyiv, and the art school was in Ukrainian. It was just a general high school, but lots of art. And so everything was in Ukrainian. It was a very sort of anti-Soviet and very culturally Ukrainian milieu that really
Right, it was
exposed
sort
me.
of subversive in a way to be speaking Ukrainian, right?
Well, I don't think it was subversive. So in Soviet times, especially late Soviet times,
Late Soviet times.
yeah, but it kind of fluctuated in the early, like in the 1930s, 1920s, early 1930s as well. So, but Ukrainian as a language was, it was an official language in the.
Yeah, that's right. When
Ukrainian
where I
Republic.
lived in Moscow, there was a Taras Shevchenko, square and statue right, a few blocks away.
Yeah, so Ukrainian was always used in some capacity. The forms you would fill in the post office would be in Ukrainian in Kyiv. But it was the culture was marginalized and ghettoized. As sort of it's this happy peasants singing songs, and nothing serious can ever be done in Ukrainian. But at the same time, I remember when I was a teenager, there was a Ukrainian magazine that would publish translated literature, and they would translate to Ukrainian the things that would be banned in Russia. So you could read Kafka in Ukrainian.
That's a great escape clause or loophole. But you never thought that Ukrainian was actually going to save your life at a checkpoint. What was the magic word?
Well, people in Ukraine believe that the Russians cannot pronounce palenitsa, which is a kind of Ukrainian bread. And so I was asked, it was sort of the password in the early days of the war. I think then they realized that a lot of people in Russia can't pronounce it probably.
Well, nonetheless,
And then my colleague, Manu Bravo, a Spanish photographer, who was with me throughout this whole adventure, had a very long beard. And so we're driving past the checkpoint, didn't stop quickly enough. They decided he's a Chechen. So sort of a lot of territorial defense guys who just got their Kalashnikovs, got really excited. And he shaved his beard off that day.
he's also taking Ukrainian lessons right now. Some of these questions, I think, are really provocative based on what you saw there and what the long-term consequences are. This one in particular stuck with me. How do you think that Ukrainians and Russians can ever have peaceful relations again after Bucha? I mean, this is a kind of a query that to me raises, a lot of the questions that Europe grappled with after World War II. And certainly, this is the bloodlands of World War II, Ukraine and Poland. Are we talking decades, centuries? What?
I think it's not just Bucha. I mean, Bucha was just,
Of course, that's
a
a shorthand for...
Yeah. I think generations of Ukrainians will carry this lesson, especially Ukrainians in the Russian-speaking East and South. Mm-hmm. And there's this conversation in the book. I was talking to the mayor of Kharkiv, who has never said a word in Ukrainian, mm-hmm. and was actually in court before the war trying to return the Soviet names of some of the streets. And he said that, the people of Eastern Ukraine are probably the most anti-Russian now for generations, because to them it's personal. The Russians came and destroyed their homes and their families, whereas for a lot of people in Western Ukraine, thankfully for them, war was mostly on television. Mm-hmm. And I think this will be carried, because every person in Ukraine has been affected. Millions have been displaced from their homes. Everybody knows somebody who died or had lost relatives. Mm-hmm. And one day there will be reconciliation, but for that to happen, Russia has to change.
So this is, I think, a really important question as well. Given that, do you think if Putin could rewind 2 years with the benefit of hindsight, do you think he would do anything differently? Do you think that he would still invade?
There's a lot of debate about this in Russia now, and there's a consensus that the way the invasion was launched was wrong. It was based on sort of false premises. And I think he would have probably invaded, but with a much larger force and in a more ruthless fashion. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because it really, the way it happened, there was an expectation that the Ukrainian army will switch sides and there wouldn't be much resistance.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that we hear a lot in our debates are evaluating still, even after more than 20 years, this question of fundamentally who is Putin? Is he a neo-imperialist who is eager to reassemble some version of the Russian Empire, or is this about Ukraine itself? Is this about the sort of the integrity of core Mother Russia? Do you have a view on that?
I think it's both of it. So obviously, he compared himself to Peter the Great not so long ago, sort of the collector of lands. And he clearly stated...
As one does.
As one does. Some people have stamps, some people have lands. So he has said repeatedly that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the biggest catastrophe of the 20th century. I'm sure lots of people would disagree with that. And Ukraine is core to Russian identity. Both presidents are named Vladimir after the great Prince of Kyiv, whose statue, giant statue Putin had built just outside the Kremlin. So if you strip away Ukraine from Russia's historical narrative, then it takes away a great part of Russia's identity.
So we're almost out of time, Yaroslav, but I want to ask you, a year from now, what is your hope for Ukraine and what is your fear for Ukraine?
Well, I think my hope is that something happens to end this war. But I know how, obviously. And my fear is that Ukraine is abandoned and the front line collapses and it faces an existential threat again.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But every time I've spoken with you, and I think the book also makes this clear, you believe that Ukrainians will keep on fighting, even if the money from Washington comes to an end, even if membership in the EU doesn't materialize, membership in NATO doesn't materialize, that they will keep fighting on.
Of course. I mean, if the money from Washington doesn't come through, it doesn't mean the war ends.
Mm-hmm.
It just means many more Ukrainians will die.
Mm-hmm.
But what is the alternative for Ukraine?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody wants to surrender and have filtration camps and concentration camps. And the Russians are pretty clear about their program. There were always articles in state media saying that, what to do with Ukraine once we take it. We have to destroy all the cultural elites physically, re-educate the children to become Russians in 3 generations. I mean, that is still the blueprint. And people like Medvedev speak pretty openly about this. They describe Ukrainianism as a virus.
Mm-hmm. So, I'm not sure I would have guessed when we first met each other, a really long time ago, I guess, more than 20 years ago now,
Well,
that war correspondent would be such a full-time occupation still, unfortunately. That is not the story of the 21st century so far.
History was supposed to have ended.
Yeah, that we anticipated. Certainly not in 1990 when you and I both graduated from college. We didn't think that that's the direction that this was going in. Are you planning to go back to the war in Ukraine?
So my plan was not to cover any more wars.
Good plan.
Yes. And then Afghanistan sort of pullout happened, and I had to go back just because I've spent so much time there and really wanted to help, and we succeeded in helping all our staff to get out of the country.
Right. So you were there actually during the fall of the.
I was in Kabul, on August 15th, and had this vivid memory of Ashraf Ghani the evening before inspecting, the ramparts outside the city and pledging to fight. Then getting to a helicopter 12 hours later, and then the Taliban walking past my hotel.
Right.
And I really...
Now you live in Dubai, where you can see a lot of the former Afghan officials probably.
Yes.
Anytime. Yeah. Well, I guess it's a story then without an ending, and the book is definitely, I think, in the middle of a war and not at the end of a war, but it is a really powerful account. Again, the name of the book is Our Enemies Will Vanish. Tell us very quickly where that comes from, the title.
So the title comes from the Ukrainian anthem, and the anthem was written in the middle of the 19th century when the language was banned by the Russians, and a lot of the people involved in sort of literary circles in Kyiv ended up in exile or in prison. And so the anthem goes, it's called, Ukraine has not died yet, which is, by itself.
Cheery part of the world.
Yes, I guess the Polish anthem sort of starts with the same words about Poland, which was also a Russian colony at the time. and German and Austrian. But the line that I refer to says, "Our enemies will vanish like dew at sunrise," which is, I think, a very poetic way of just wishing that your enemies,
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a kind of a hopeful, title for your book. It's a hopeful framing for a war whose outcome is not yet fully determined. Again, Yaroslav, thank you, and congratulations on this important book. Thank you, all of you, for spending your time with us.
Thank you.
And I think there's a reception as well, yeah? Upstairs? Just right outside. And Yaroslav is available to sign books, and I hope you get lots of them. Good gifts.